Rick will introduce himself, and he's going to give us a bit of a roundup of worldwide research that's going on. Welcome, Rick, and thank you.
So my name is Rick Steeds. I'm a cardiology consultant in Birmingham and I work with Tarek Hewat and Charlie Dawson and other members of the team looking after Alström patients from the National Service in collaboration with Alström UK. I am also clinical lead for the scientific research group and research group of the Alström UK Society. So I've been asked just to review research published and give you some idea about what research is currently going on in the UK. So I think the first thing to say is that, sorry, I'm just going to, I don't know if you can see that at the side, it's a bit of a nuisance. So I'm just going to take that away. Yeah. So the first thing to say is this is data from PubMed, just looking at the numbers of articles published about Alström's syndrome. And you can see that there's been a big growth in the last 10 or 15 years. So people are research active across the world and in the UK and are looking for new solutions. There are limits to those studies. I think that it's fair to say that many studies are still limited to single center studies, and many of them are still studies that look at individual cases or small cohorts of cases that describe clinical manifestations or de novo gene variants and phenotypic variants. So that's the way that you appear. There are some basic research. Again, it's rather intermittent, although there are a few studies analyzing therapy and disease reversing phenomena. I'm just going to go through. This is an important case report, which I think is important to review because there's certainly been some discussions about whether or not cardiac transplantation works in Alström syndrome because potentially of complications. So it's fair to say that heart transplantation in general is restricted. That's because there has always been a shortage of donor organs, but I'm sure many of you know that in the UK, there has been a change in the law that you now have to opt out of giving up your organs rather than an understanding that you would not do so unless you positively said so. So there has been an uptick in the numbers of available donor organs. One of the other problems that we have faced in referring patients for consideration of cardiac transplantation in Birmingham is that many patients with Alström syndrome, by the time they get to that point of referral, have problems with other organs. So, for example, typically the kidney and the liver, and that will put off units that are really trying to make sure that the hearts are given to people with good life expectancy. So average life expectancy now with the cardiac transplant is 9 years, but recently you will have seen in the news, there is a lady who is now 40 years out from her transplant. So the life expectancy is good following transplantation. This case report described a 17-year-old male who had infantile cardiomyopathy with full recovery and then started to be very unwell from 11 years onwards with severe LV dysfunction and also had fatty liver disease. He was insulin resistant and he had a transplantation following a presentation during which he suffered a cardiac arrest and due to severe heart failure because of cardiomyopathy, and he recovered successfully following transplantation. So I thought I would share this because I think it's just important to understand that cardiac transplantation does remain a viable option. Most of the successful transplants in the UK have happened in children and young adults. And so there is still a question about proof of transplantation in adults, although there have been 1 or 2 adult transplants successfully performed. This is a combined study, which was a randomized controlled trial of of setmelanotide, which is a melanocortin 4 receptor agonist. And it was based on the concept that impaired ciliary signaling in this particular receptor may drive obesity, and therefore thought that setmelanotide may be particularly of use in Bardet-Biedl and Alström syndrome. I think many of the UK patients with Alström, I believe there are around 20 of them who started with setmelanotide with a reasonably good effect. So this was a 14-week double-blind placebo-controlled randomized study of setmelanotide in a small cohort of patients, 38 in total, 19 randomized to care and 19 randomized to equivalent placebo. But the majority were Bardet-Biedl, and there were only 3 Alström syndrome patients in each. The primary endpoint was the number of people achieving more than 10% body weight loss, and 32% achieved that target. So not a huge success, but successful in some, and that weight loss was maintained at 52 weeks. It's of interest, I think, that actually yesterday in our research meeting, Dr. Hewat and his team presented some data about setmelanotide in the 20 who have had it in the UK, and the average weight loss in those cohorts has been between 5 and 6 kilograms over approximately 6 months. But the major changes were in significant improvements in lipid profile, in fatty liver deposits, and also in diabetic control. This is a study that is interesting because it looked at what we know is an end stage in Alström, which is that patients with Alström can develop fibrosis that scars the kidney and in the liver and in the heart. And this was a study to look at the role of the Alström-1 protein, which is not fully characterized or understood, in something called the TGF-beta pathway, which is a cell cycle that controls apoptosis. Apoptosis is programmed cell death. So all of your cells have a limited life expectancy, and apoptosis is the term given to when cells decide to end their lives. Cell migration and cell adhesion are all important properties of how cells interact with each other. And this was an isolated stem cell preparation from a human cervical cell that looked particularly at mitochondrial activity, because there has been some thoughts as to whether Alström-1 protein might interfere with the cells, how the cells generate energy. And that is how the mitochondria are productive. So the mitochondria are the energy generating part of the cells. But this study found no alteration in mitochondrial activity. It did find that actually there was a reduction in cell apoptosis. So you might think that actually if Alström ends up in reducing programmed cell death, that would be a good thing. But one of the reasons why cells are programmed to die after a period of time is that components within the cell can wear out, and then cells themselves can undergo toxic change. So that's not necessarily a good thing to have a reduction in cell apoptosis. And it's also thought that OLMS1, reduction in OLMS1 protein, starts to increase cell cycle arrest, which means an interruption of normal cell cycling and cell apoptosis. Again, exposes potentially issues with Alström-1 protein that can result in changes within the cells that may be more persistent and toxic. This is an interesting study by Vincent Marion, who many of you will know has been involved in the Alström international scene for quite a long time, and has been looking at how insulin resistance happens. And it was based on previous work that inactivation of the OLMS1 protein directly inhibited glucose absorption in adipose tissue, and that this glucose absorption, the failure of glucose absorption in adipose tissue, tends to result in an increase in insulin release from beta cells, and that increase in insulin release also ends up resulting in greater insulin resistance. So cells become intolerant of higher levels of insulin. Actually, this study was interesting because it showed that if you reactivate OLMS1 protein, that seems to reserve the adipose tissue insulin resistance. And also that ALMS1 binds to protein kinase C in adipose cells and on signaling and seems to promote insulin resistance. So actually Vincent and his team went on to describe a new peptide that targets insulin resistance and is a potential new way of looking at treatment for insulin resistance. So that's a positive move based on research in Alström syndrome. Those people who came to our Alström meeting last year also knows that Tarek and his team described quite significant increases in bone density in people with Alström syndrome. And this is an interesting study that moves a little bit further and compared results in bone turnover in 18 patients with 42 age-matched controls and found that there was a significant reduction in osteocalcin release, a reduction in OPG and something called S-rankle, which is a receptor activator of nuclear factor that's involved in generation of bones. And actually, what this suggested is that the increased bone density that's found in Alström syndrome might be related to a reduction in bone turnover in Alström syndrome, and that in turn might be related to insulin resistance. This comes from Lucy Dalton, who again, people who have been over the last year or so to the Alström service in the UK, presented an audiometric profile of 41 adults with Alström syndrome, including 34 patients with available audiograms, and documented that all had sensorineural hearing loss, and that this deteriorated progressively over time, and that severe and profound sensorineural hearing loss was present in around about a quarter of all patients with Alström syndrome, and that use of hearing aids is common in the adult population. This, I think, is interesting because, again, during one of the purposes behind the research committee and scientific committee was really to highlight some of the issues that have been pointed out at board level, which is that many people who have many people with Alström syndrome, parents and relatives of families, have wondered why it takes such a long time for many people to be diagnosed with the condition, and whether there could be moves that could make that diagnosis sooner. And one of the issues is that I think is very interesting is that we did try to chase up the delivery of routine genetic testing for all children with infantile cardiomyopathy within the first 3 months of life. And in fact, that is supposed to be added to a national panel that can be used in infants who present with heart failure. The question is whether all doctors do that. But in fact, interestingly, out of the Alström UK survey, all of the patients who had infantile cardiomyopathy received a formal diagnosis of Alström out of those surveyed within their first year of life. So the problem seems to be greater in people who aren't diagnosed within the first year of life. And I thought this was just interesting because this was a case report of a child being diagnosed in a syndromic obesity clinic. So one of the things that was discussed yesterday was about targeting clinicians to bring up their awareness in specific areas in the health service. So that would be obesity clinics, in those who have ophthalmic problems, and in audiology clinics, really to highlight the diagnosis of Alström and to improve clinician awareness of Alström syndrome. This is a study which was reported at the end of last year, and I've added this in because I also think it's interesting. It's by Pietro's group, and it was a study to routinely investigate cognitive function in 19 people with Alström syndrome, 13 adults and 6 children. And what was interesting about this is clearly we understand that Alström syndrome is not associated with intellectual impairment, and there are many people who are very high achieving with Alström syndrome in terms of educational success. But I think it's really interesting that there were what was quite commonly identified is with the presence of buccofacial apraxia. That's really just a difficulty in coordinating movements of your mouth and an oral cavity. And that's something that we've discussed in the Alström service, because Sham Madatil has always said it's been very, very difficult to get people to perform spirometry tests or breathing tests to check on lung capacity because of the issue of recurrent infections. And that's because of this buccofacial apraxia, which means that it's just very difficult for people with Alström syndrome to actually coordinate the huff puff that you need to do to create a reliable spirometry reading. And actually, the other interesting aspect of this is that these changes were present and seems to be in a location within the frontal lobe that's not directly related to the metabolic components, and maybe a direct abnormality as a result of the Alström-1 protein changes. Just my final two slides are just to summarize about what we've done in the medical and scientific advisory group. We had meetings in March and in November 2022. March was the kickoff meeting, and really set out by Kerry with aims particularly to encourage collaboration between clinicians and basic scientists. And I think that in Birmingham, that we've done quite a lot of work to try to characterize or what we call phenotype, the physical features of people with Alström syndrome, of their heart and their liver and their kidneys. But that descriptive process and the understanding of how the disease affects people really needs to be married up with basic science. One of the aims was to identify gaps in current research and identify priorities. That's still work that needs to be done. And there was very much an agreement to focus on translational work that will deliver improved care and treatment. ASUK committed to coordinate the medical and scientific advisory group and have also created an online shared area of exchange for research. Some broad themes were brought out, which were really brought out by Professor Semple from Edinburgh, which was that it's really helpful. And I think many people with Alström syndrome will increasingly be asked if they are prepared to let us hold on to cell, blood and tissue samples for basic research, because so much can be learned from the study of individual cells in isolated cell preparations, and also in terms of blood samples and tissue samples. There's been a discussion about where we get funding. Funding for research is always difficult, and I know that yesterday it was expressed that some people would very much like to raise money for Alström research, which I think is a great idea. One of the ways, if I give you an example, the money usually needs to be quite substantial, but there is a company that's an offshoot, a charitable offshoot of a company called LifeArt that has just advertised £500,000 research grants to be competed between 4 universities. And in Birmingham, there are 3 or 4 applications for study of Alström syndrome. So one possibility is simply to have a charity to raise an amount of money, say 50 or £100,000, and then ask people to compete for that money to support specific research streams in Alström. And that sounds funny, but it actually encourages lots of different research groups in different universities to potentially start research in Alström. There are thoughts from Professor Semple about providing a program grant, really to try to combine different research units who might be active in the Alström sphere, and also as an expectation that will open up the medical and scientific advisory group outside of the UK and seek European collaboration to go for European grants. I know Pietro has been involved in a European application, although I don't know how that's gone. And then there were also yesterday some presentations just looking at work that is currently in progress. So Sadaf Ali is a research registrar who's currently working for Tarek Hiwat, and is specifically asking the question, with a university team, are lymphocytes the driver of inflammation in Alström syndrome? And that comes out of work that was done by Dr. Baig, who was my research fellow, and he basically created a heat map for RNA, which are the transmitting genes from genetic defects, and finding out from that heat map that some of the things that are really turned on in adipose tissue and Alström syndrome are inflammatory RNAs. And it's an attempt to try to work out how that is important in how the gene defect results the Alström disease. Katja Gemlich and I are working on a project with Subhadra, who's another research fellow, looking at Alström as a model of accelerated senescence. So senescence is the process of aging. And our preliminary work has shown that using a score that was created in COVID, on average, adult patients with Alström are around about 15 or 16 years physically older than they should be. And there is quite a big science going around senescence and accelerated aging. And that's interesting because there are also quite well-known therapies that are under trial at the moment for anti-aging remedies and anti-senescence, which could be repurposed in Alström. And there is an active project looking at whether beta cell defect is a primary driver of insulin resistance in Alström syndrome. And that's also seeking further funding at the moment to be expanded. So I'm going to stop there. That's a summary of the research published over the last year and a sight of what is going on in the UK. Thanks very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Rick. Can you hear me, Catherine? Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, so we missed our yoga session. So rather than do a Q&A at the end of the next two sessions, we'll do a Q&A with Rick now. So if people have got questions, if you pop those in the Q&A box. And as you're doing that, if I can ask you a couple of questions, Rick. So what does single center studies, what does that mean?
I'm sorry, I missed that. You cut out just as you said that.
Single center studies.
Okay, so I think one of the problems in Alström syndrome is that many of the studies are located at a given single institution. And that's what I mean by single center studies. And in an ultra rare disease like Alström, one of the difficulties is, for example, in our studies using MRI to try to investigate and interrogate the heart, you can only try to look at so many risk factors for progression in disease. There are statistical reasons why you're limited about the numbers of factors that you try to identify as an association for changes that we see over time. And the bigger the population, the more you can characterize different risk factors. So having collaborative projects that really combine patient data that is done in a structured way in a whole series of centers is a really great way of making progress and doing things like that. So it's just a reflection of the fact that what's tended to happen is people have described studies of one patient or maybe 10 patients or 20 patients, and we can get up to 30 or 40 patients because of the size of the group in the service in Birmingham. But it would be much better doing bigger studies across collaborative studies across countries.
So what, as you know, we have quite a thorough database, but what would help from other countries? What sort of information would help?
So I think that goes to the ground of what we want to do going forward as a scientific community. So yesterday, one of the comments was about discussing about how we expand and include our European partners and whether we want to be limited to Europe and go wider and go across the globe. I think one of the difficulties with any type of program is that you need to make sure that you can collaborate in a positive way, and academics aren't always particularly good at sharing research, neither are clinicians. But going into a European program offers the opportunity to grow, for example, into European research applications. So you will have seen in the news that one of the problems with Brexit is that it's become much harder to access European money for research.
Okay, thank you. I've got some questions coming in. Let me just ask you one other question. So when you're measuring lung function, and lots of parents will know that youngsters and adults and things can't blow, can't puff. Is there any other way to measure lung function that isn't invasive?
No, because one of the reasons why, one of the important ways of checking on your lung function is that huff. So it's not actually just being able to puff, it's about being able to close your mouth around and create an airtight seal so that the machine accurately measures what you're puffing. But that gives you information about your capacity to generate a variety of measures that you can make on respiratory function. There are passive measurements that you can do, but they are much more complicated and they involve much more money.
Okay.
I'm not an expert at it, but
okay. Thank you. So Catherine's going to read out some of the questions, I hope.
Okay, so we have one from Aisha, which is kind of more of a general question really about what should be done to stop progressing the disease.
Prof samples online. I think one of the things that we almost certainly need to do is we need to start to build programs together. And I think one of the things that has been really interesting, so it takes a long time for studies to come up with treatments, and we still don't really fully understand exactly what Alström 1 as a protein does. And we have to understand that before you can actively define a drug or a treatment or a therapy that can change things. And I think that one of the positive things that came out yesterday is that Rob and his group have been doing basic research in Alström for a number of years. And we are starting up with 3 or 4 different programs that have a lot of capacity. And I think once you get a groundswell, which is why I put up that graph right at the start showing the publications in Alström syndrome, there is a growth in Alström syndrome and there are more groups, and we will encourage more groups. And I think it'll become a positive effect. At the moment, there isn't a treatment, but that, I think, that's the point of going back to basic research.
Thank you. Catherine?
No more coming in at the minute. Kerry, if you've
we've got some in the chat.
Cool.
So thanks, Rick. Can I ask what is maybe one thing that patients and families could do to further the research or treatments into Alström syndrome? And this comes by the back of, I know we talked about this yesterday, a question that somebody sent in about whether ASUK could get involved in lobbying health authorities or, to raise money for Alström, I think. And this came up at the meeting that we had with Burned in Germany as well. I think lots of us are happy to go out there and to look at trying to raise money, but I think it's sometimes really difficult when we don't know what we're raising money for.
So what I felt would be useful, I think it's very interesting and it's been very illuminating having this potential so LifeArc put out, advertised £500,000 to be split between 5 or 6 projects across the University of Birmingham. And it's been astonishing how that money has flushed out a whole variety of different scientific groups at the University of Birmingham to do all sorts of different research. And because it's translational, they were very keen in trying to get people committed to join up with clinicians doing translational work in the rare disease sphere. So I think that one of the things that's interesting is it's forced a lot of collaborations and new groups potentially interested in doing research. So my personal feeling is that if it was possible to advertise a grant or a sum of money on a period that as a group of patients and interested clinicians that we could raise and put together, that I think that would certainly attract people. People are always looking for funding, and they're looking for ways in which they can use their research technology in different areas. And that's one thought. I think putting pressure onto government at the moment, I would suggest, but again, Rob Semple probably knows more about this than I do, Prof Semple, is that one of the problems in the UK is that charitable organisations like the British Heart Foundation have had a big drop in their income through COVID, and they've really struggled because of that. And coming out of it, they're really focusing on big projects. So really big collaborative projects looking at big diseases that affect a lot of people, and they are spending less money on rare disease research. I don't know about government funding and the MRC and NIHR, but there's also been quite a call in the scientific committee that amounts of monies has been falling for research support. And I can't foresee that, given the problems that we have with our national economy, that is going to change in the near future. So while I understand that the idea of putting pressure on government to increase research funding would be interesting, I'm slightly sceptical about whether you'll get very far.
Okay, thank you. A question from Christopher that says, is there a central area where clinicians can go and read about this research? For example, those with the condition or their doctors can read about it.
So that's interesting. So Alström UK have created a central location or a repository for published articles around Alström. I think actually in terms of a local resource for interested clinicians, nowadays search engines and our ability to find out information is so much better than it was before. I'm not entirely sure that you really need that. If you want to look and put into any of our databases or research archives, you can find out quite a lot of information about Alström syndrome. I think one of the things is interesting, again, that we discussed yesterday. One of the problems is about clinicians knowing whether or not a patient has got Alström. Once they've identified Alström, it's making them click, and they're not aware of it because it's such a rare disease that it doesn't come at the front. And that's why there's a delay to diagnosis, or people don't necessarily know what to do when they meet somebody. But I mean, one of the things I think is also a potential is that we have mentioned about putting directors to Alström UK on the, on all of our clinical letters, so that when they go out, they always go to a local clinician, to a GP and otherwise, and that gives them access to a central repository. And of course, they can also speak with Alström UK, who quite often would put clinicians who've got patients into contact. So following emails from the society, I've been in contact with cardiologists in America and in several different places.
Yeah, okay. And then just on the current treatments that we've got. So I know you mentioned the setmelanotide trial, which I think it's been really good for the community to have sort of the Prometic trial and then the setmelanotide trial, but unfortunately they've not been that successful in developing treatments for Alström. But I think that the learning from that hopefully is really what's helping to accelerate some of this research, just like you said, from the work that Shanat's done. But then moving on to the newer, the drugs that are available now. So like we discussed yesterday, the semaglutide, and I know that Pietro's looking at liraglutide, and that's part of the Horizon grant as well. And so they are treatments that are on the market. They are licensed. So hopefully that's something, and I know Johnny's going to be talking later about potential of repurposed drugs. I just wonder whether it would be useful for us to kind of look at the medicines that are being used in Alström in pediatrics and in adults, and have we got a clear idea of that? I'm just thinking something that we can then share with others globally around the medicines that do seem to be having a benefit.
Yes, we could do that. I think we could do that, setting up what you really want to do under these circumstances is a placebo-controlled trial, a randomized placebo-controlled trial, as a hardcore way of defining evidence. The problem about that is that actually setting that up under current guidance, even with an established drug, is very expensive, and it takes a significant commitment. If you get an ideal way of running a study is to involve a clinical trials unit, but then it becomes almost prohibitively expensive because the costs of involvement of clinical trials groups for a 2-year study will be somewhere in the order of somewhere between £500,000 and £750,000. So then you're looking to see if standard drugs that we think work, for example, if I think about ACE inhibitors in patients with impaired left ventricular function, we could determine whether that improves patients' cardiac function in people with normal function, but you would need to follow them for quite a long time, and you'd need quite a big cohort, and it would be expensive to do. So the trouble is doing it properly, which is how you would want to do it, is not cheap.
Okay. We've got a question from Becky. We're experiencing early stages of fibrosis of heart and liver. Is there evidence that omega-3 supplements can help delay fibrosis of organs?
No. None at all. And actually, it'll be interesting to hear talks coming on now, because I think there was a lot of discussion yesterday about where fibrosis sits in the pathogenesis or the development of disease in Alström, and whether that is a byproduct or just an end result of a series of other processes, and actually trying to treat the fibrosis itself is probably too late. And actually maybe what you need to do is try to hit the disease or the disease processes before you get the fibrosis. But we never know whether fibrosis is a byproduct or just an end stage or a result, or actually is part of the disease itself. It's one of the things we tried to look at by studying fibrosis serially over time in patients, but we suffered from the problem that in our MRI study, we only had about 30 patients with serial studies over 10 years. And actually the changes were really, really small. And then we couldn't look at the things that we wanted to look at, which is, for example, triglycerides, elevated triglycerides, which reflect often poor diabetic control or insulin resistance, has been identified as a potential pro-fibrotic trigger. And so we were very interested to see if people with very high triglycerides had developed progressive fibrosis over time, but the changes were too small, and it was it was insignificant. It was negative, but we're not sure whether it was negative because we didn't have enough people and didn't have enough side effect, or whether it just actually is not really involved.
Okay. I don't know if you can answer this question, and I'll come back to Anne, and if not, Diana will be able to get it answered for you afterwards. But there was a question earlier from Diana that says, is there any relationship between gallbladder inflammation and Alström disease?
I have no idea.
Yeah, we can find that out after, Diana, and come back to you.
Absolutely no idea. You're asking a heart doctor. I'm afraid I get lost as soon as I go below the chest.
No problem. Right, Anne, back to you.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay, Catherine? Yeah. So just a final question for you, Rick. Later on, we're going to hear from Hassan about his extraordinary expedition on his bike and how much weight he's lost and how fit he's got.
Yeah.
Should part of what we're doing really focus on behavioural change?
So I think that there are a couple of things I would say about this. Firstly, do we have evidence specifically in Alström syndrome itself? We have some evidence. So Richard Paisley, when we all cycled from Torbay up to Birmingham, did very detailed studies of 2 participants and their insulin resistance and the diabetic control during a period of quite intense exercise. And during that time, the 4 or 5 days that we do, despite the fact that we ended up having a couple of beers in the evening and eating well in the evening, had excellent diabetic control. So over time, improved diabetes and improved control of insulin resistance would be great. Now, I know that means not everyone can cycle all day, every day. So that's not possible, but improving exercise routinely and doing things like Pietro's talk earlier on about following a Mediterranean diet is absolutely the way to go, I think, because of Alström, because of that evidence. But in general, the other thing is that we have seen in around about 20% of patients with Alström syndrome, atherosclerotic heart disease. So that's happening at a much earlier age. And we know from post-mortem samples that on 1 or 2 people that we've looked at, they've had silent heart attacks. And we've seen that on scans as well in people. So that's happening in people when they're 30 or 40. whereas usually that happens in people of the age of 60 and 70, where you can avoid developing, well, you can't avoid developing atherosclerosis, but you can certainly improve it if you exercise and follow a good diet. So I think on 2 grounds, evidence specifically in Alström and specifically and in general, preventing progressive cardiovascular disease is a good thing to do. So I always go on about people exercising.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Rick. Any other questions we will gather and hopefully send on to you.
There is one other question that Kerry specifically asked me yesterday, and she said that somebody had asked, and I think she was going to say it earlier on but forgot. So one of the questions is, why isn't gene therapy on the cards in Alström syndrome? And I am not a gene therapist, but I have been involved in some gene therapy trials in another rare disease called Fabry disease, which is an enzyme deficiency that results in deposition of lipids within cells. And there are effective gene therapies for that, but it's quite different because it's modifying a single enzyme that I think is relatively small. And my understanding from the conversation we had yesterday is that gene therapy in Alström is very difficult because it involves encoding a very large protein, and the pathways are much less well known about how you would then regenerate or create an Alström protein and how that would work.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Rick. And also I think that's going to tip you off, Johnny. I think you've joined us. That would be a question for you later on as well, because I think, you know, people have heard around gene therapy trials, particularly for retinitis pigmentosa and for studies that's going on in Bardet-Biedl syndrome. I know we discussed it at our research meeting in Germany around the potential of either repurposed drugs or looking at gene therapy for vision, because I think it is always one of the top research priorities for people with Alström around, you know, other treatments to prevent people from losing their sight. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rick. We'll gather those questions together